For decades, Bob Weir has been one of the most visible yet most misunderstood figures in American music. As a founding member of the Grateful Dead, his voice, rhythm guitar, and presence became part of a cultural earthquake that reshaped how music, freedom, and community were defined. Millions saw him on stage, smiling, loose, eternal. But what almost no one ever saw was the private man behind that image, the version of Bob Weir that existed away from the lights, the crowds, and the mythology. And according to those closest to him, there was a time when Bob tried to make sense of that private self the only way he knew how, by writing it down. The idea of a diary tied to Bob Weir has floated quietly for years, never confirmed, never denied. Friends hinted at notebooks. Family members spoke vaguely about things he used to write. Nothing sensational, nothing scandalous, just fragments. But when people close to him finally began speaking more openly in recent years, fans realized something unsettling. Bob Weir had spent much of his life wrestling with thoughts and fears he never shared publicly, even during the height of the Dead's confessional, free love era. The man associated with openness and improvisation was, in many ways, profoundly guarded. Bob Weir's life did not begin in freedom. It began in instability. Abandoned by his biological parents as an infant and adopted by a family in California, Bob grew up with a quiet awareness that he was, in some way, unwanted at the start. Those early emotional fractures rarely show on the surface, but they tend to echo across a lifetime. Friends from his youth described him as restless, sharp, funny, but also distant. Music became not just a passion, but an anchor, a way to belong without having to explain himself. When the Grateful Dead formed, Bob was still a teenager. The band was not just a group, it was a moving experiment, a living organism fueled by LSD, philosophy, rebellion, and relentless touring. Jerry Garcia became the spiritual center, Phil Lesh became the cerebral backbone, and Bob Weir? Bob was the glue, the rhythm that held chaos together. Yet that role came at a cost. Bob was often criticized for not being deep enough, not being as technically gifted, not being the genius. Those criticisms stayed with him longer than fans realized. According to people close to the band, Bob began writing privately during periods of intense tension, after arguments, after shows that went wrong, after moments when the Dead felt like it might collapse under its own weight. These writings were not intended for publication. They were raw attempts to process survival inside a machine that never stopped moving. Fame came fast, and unlike Jerry, Bob never pretended to be comfortable with being worshipped. He understood early on that the crowd didn't see him, they saw a symbol. As the years passed, the Dead became a lifestyle as much as a band. Endless touring, endless drugs, endless expectations. Bob Weir was surrounded by people constantly, yet often felt profoundly alone. Family members later hinted that Bob used writing to ground himself when everything else felt unreal. He wrote about exhaustion, about the strange guilt of surviving when others didn't, about watching friends lose themselves to addiction while knowing he was never fully immune. The death of Pigpen shook him, the death of Brent Meidland devastated him, and then came Jerry Garcia's death, the moment that permanently split Bob Weir's life into before and after. Those closest to Bob say that if there was ever a period when his private writings deepened, it was after Jerry died, not because Bob wanted sympathy, but because he was suddenly forced to confront a terrifying truth. The thing that defined his entire adult life was gone, and he was still standing. What stunned many fans years later was learning just how conflicted Bob felt about that survival. He loved Jerry, he relied on him, and yet he had also lived in Jerry's shadow. Bob's private reflections reportedly wrestled with gratitude and resentment at the same time, feelings that are human but rarely admitted when legends are involved. He questioned whether the Dead could ever truly exist without Jerry, and whether he himself even knew who he was outside that identity. As Bob Weir aged, the public saw a man who seemed to age gracefully, still touring, still smiling, still playing songs written half a century earlier. But behind the scenes, Bob was reckoning with mortality, relevance, and legacy. Family members have said that Bob became increasingly reflective, increasingly aware that history would eventually freeze him into a single image, something he had spent his whole life resisting. The most surprising element, according to those who've read fragments of his private reflections, is how deeply Bob questioned the counterculture itself, the drugs, the freedom, the chaos, the romanticism. He didn't disown it, but he didn't glorify it either. He wrote about the lives that were lost along the way, about how easy it was to confuse rebellion with escape, about how many people never came back from the edge. For fans, the idea that Bob Weir carried these thoughts quietly for decades is unsettling because it clashes with the myth. The myth says the dead were carefree, that they floated through life on music and love. The reality, Bob understood, was far more complicated. Freedom came with consequences, improvisation came with instability, and being a cultural icon meant losing control over your own narrative. In later years, Bob Weir became more open but still selective. He spoke about health, about discipline, about staying alive when so many peers didn't. Yet even then, there remained a sense that some truths were meant to stay private, not because they were shameful, but because they were fragile, personal, untouchable by the noise of public consumption. The fascination with a so-called secret diary isn't really about hidden scandals. It's about the hunger to know the man beneath the legend, to understand how someone can live an entire life in front of millions and still keep parts of themselves unseen. Bob Weir's story reminds us that even icons need places where no one is watching, places where honesty doesn't need applause. And maybe that's the real revelation, not that Bob Weir had secrets, but that he had boundaries. In a culture that devours its heroes, that might be the most radical thing of all.